He returned from the war to live peacefully on a farm with his dog. But one day, they noticed that the water had become strange murky, with a chemical smell. Investigating, he stumbled upon a secret dumping ground for toxins and realized that a powerful corporation was behind it, ready to destroy anyone who stood in its way. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning sun crept slowly over the rolling fields of the Midwest, spilling pale gold across the wooden porch where Jonathan Reeves sat with a chipped mug of coffee cupped between his hands. He had been awake long before dawn, as he always was. Sleep had never returned to him fully after the war. The lingering stiffness in his leg was a constant reminder of Afghanistan, as were the restless dreams that pulled him from bed before the rooster's call. Beside him, sprawled on the porch boards, lay Rocco, his faithful German shepherd, grizzled around the muzzle, the same dog that had once sniffed out IEDs and saved Jonathan's life more times than he could count. Out here, in this forgotten corner of America, they were both trying to start over. Jonathan's farm was a patchwork of old and new. The land had been in his family for generations, but years of neglect had left it weary and unkempt when he inherited it after his father's death. The farmhouse still bore scars of age, peeling white paint, shutters that hung crookedly, a roof patched more times than he cared to remember. Yet the soil, dark and stubborn, held promise. Over 2 seasons, Jonathan had coaxed life back into the fields, repaired fences, replaced rusted irrigation lines, and stocked the barn with a modest herd of cattle and a pair of horses for light work. Farming was hard in ways combat had never been, but it was honest. Each seed sown was a small defiance against the chaos he'd left behind. Life settled into a rhythm. Dawn meant chores, feeding livestock, checking water levels, walking the fence line with Rocco padding silently at his side. Midday brought the sweat of fieldwork, tractor engines coughing to life, the smell of diesel and soil. Nights were quiet except for the chirring of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle. In that silence, Jonathan felt a measure of healing, as if each passing day planted him more firmly into the earth he was reclaiming. Neighbors began to wave when they passed his long gravel drive. Some stopped by to share advice, trade tools, or simply talk. Though he remained guarded, wary of conversation that probed too deep, he was no longer invisible. Spring arrived with a sudden green flush after a long, biting winter. It was during those first weeks of planting that Jonathan began to notice things that did not feel right. At first it was subtle. The lower pasture seemed slower to green, the soil damp but oddly lifeless. Then came the smell. Not sharp, not foul exactly, but chemical. On certain mornings, a faint, acrid tang drifted from the irrigation ditch that fed his southern fields. When he leaned over the water to investigate, he saw a faint rainbow film dancing across the surface. He rubbed it between his fingers. It clung slick and oily, refusing to wash away. Rocco noticed it before Jonathan wanted to admit anything was wrong. The dog had always been cautious but steady, a creature trained to sniff danger long before humans could sense it. One warm afternoon, Jonathan watched him approach the pond that supplied the farm's troughs. The shepherd sniffed, hackles rising slightly, and then stepped back with a low, uneasy rumble deep in his chest. He refused to drink. Over the next days, Rocco skirted the pond entirely, preferring the rain barrel by the porch. That same week, Jonathan caught one of his calves nosing the trough and then pulling away, tongue curling, as if the water burned bitter on its mouth. Jonathan's first instinct was practical. Farming demanded solutions, not panic. He tore apart the irrigation lines, expecting to find algae clogs or a decaying animal fouling the flow. He scrubbed troughs, flushed pipes, and checked the well pump. Everything appeared sound. Yet the water coming in from the creek, his main lifeline, still carried that elusive sheen and that faint chemical bite. The crops nearest the lower ditches began to wilt before they should have, leaves yellowing, stems going limp as though thirsting despite the steady watering. It didn't fit. Not with the rain they'd had. Not with the careful rotation he followed. A knot of unease tightened in his chest. Combat had taught him to trust small signs, the off note in an empty street, the way animals go silent before gunfire. He found himself watching the creek with the same wary patience he had once given distant ridgelines in hostile valleys. One afternoon, he discovered a scatter of dead fish along the muddy bank, their bellies bloated, gills gaping wide. Frogs that had once chorused at dusk were strangely absent now, and when he turned over a stone near the waterline, the usual quick scatter of insects was gone. Even the air felt stiller, heavier. Rocco grew lethargic as the weeks passed. At first, Jonathan blamed age. The shepherd was no longer young. But the dog's change was too sudden. He moved slower, his appetite dulled, and some nights, Jonathan felt the faint tremor of muscles shuddering against his boots as they sat on the porch together. He knelt and ran his hands through the thick fur, whispering quiet words only the dog could hear. The bond between them was forged in places where death had been a daily companion. Seeing his partner falter stirred something protective, something furious deep in Jonathan's gut. Still, he hesitated. The nearest town was small, its politics tangled. He'd heard rumors about industry upriver, but the plant was said to have closed long ago. Farmers whispered about runoff when yields dropped, but no one acted. It was easier to blame weather, to hope for better luck next season. Jonathan wanted to believe it too. He wanted his hard-won peace to remain intact. One morning changed that. He woke before sunrise, intending to repair fencing on the north field. When he approached the lower pasture, a heifer lay sprawled near the trough, sides heaving. Foam clung to her lips, eyes rolling white in confusion. Panic surged through him as he knelt, recognizing the tremors in her limbs, the same tremors he'd seen in Rocco at night. The animal struggled, legs thrashing weakly, and then went still. The silence afterward was vast and accusing. Jonathan stood over the body, heart hammering, the dawn light turning the creek silver behind him. His mind snapped into the focused clarity he hadn't felt since the service. Something was deeply, dangerously wrong with the water feeding this land. He could no longer pretend it was nothing. He would find out what was poisoning his farm, no matter where the trail led. That day, he walked the length of his property, boots sinking in damp soil, Rocco limping faithfully at his side. They followed the creek as it twisted through cottonwood stands and narrow banks choked with weeds. Jonathan studied every bend and culvert, every sign of disturbance. The water ran sluggish, discolored in places where sunlight struck. Dead fish snagged in eddies, and a muskrat floated lifeless against a snag of branches. It was not an accident. It wasn't nature. When he returned to the farmhouse that evening, exhausted and streaked with mud, the old feeling of a mission settling on his shoulders, he realized the quiet life he'd been building might be over. He fed Rocco carefully, noting the dog's tired movements, then sat alone at the kitchen table long after the sun went down. Maps were spread before him, old survey charts of the creek and property lines he'd inherited. He marked the path he had traced that day and where he would go tomorrow. There was more upstream, beyond his boundary. Somewhere there was an answer, and he would find it. Outside, the fields lay dark and silent, but the unease that had crept into his world no longer whispered. It roared. Jonathan Reeves had been a soldier before he was a farmer, and soldiers did not look away from threats. As he scratched behind Rocco's ears, feeling the dog lean wearily against his leg, He knew one thing for certain. Whatever was killing his land and sickening his partner had come from beyond his fence. He would track it to its source, even if it meant waking every ghost of war he had tried so hard to bury. The next morning dawned pale and cold, a thin mist hanging over the fields like a veil. Jonathan Reeves saddled his horse before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, a coiled tension already wound tight inside him. The discovery of the dead heifer the day before had broken the fragile illusion that the strange water might be harmless. As he checked the cinch and tightened the reins, Rocco trotted out from the porch, slower than in his younger years, but still determined to stay at his master's side. Jonathan patted the dog's head with a hand, rough from years of labor and war, then swung into the saddle. The farm behind him was quiet, but he felt the weight of every acre pressing him forward. Something upstream was poisoning his land, and he could not wait for someone else to care. The creek's edge was choked with reeds and driftwood, and the horses' hooves splashed softly as they followed its meandering course. Hours passed as Jonathan moved steadily upstream, eyes scanning for any change in the landscape. He passed through stands of cottonwood and overgrown fields, long abandoned to weeds. Old fences sagged where they met the water, and once or twice he dismounted to push aside fallen branches blocking the way. Rocco ranged ahead, nose to the ground, ears swiveling at every faint sound. The dog's movements were slower than Jonathan liked, but his resolve seemed unshaken. As the day warmed, the smell in the air changed. It was subtle at first, a faint chemical tang beneath the earthy scent of mud and grass, but it grew stronger with each mile. The creek itself shifted from clear to cloudy, an unnatural milky haze creeping through the current. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he leaned forward in the saddle, following the signs like a tracker on a mission. The soldier in him was awake now, cataloging details, alert to danger. Rocco stopped more often, sniffing and whining softly, a low warning in his throat. Near midday, Jonathan found what he had half expected and fully dreaded. Beyond a bend where the trees gave way to a clearing, the ruins of an industrial site sprawled along the bank. Rusting pipes jutted from the earth, and cracked concrete tanks sat half-sunk in weeds. He remembered this place vaguely, an old processing plant that had closed when he was a boy. Everyone said it was dead, another casualty of changing times. But the fresh tire tracks in the dirt told a different story. Wide ruts from heavy trucks cut through the grass, and the gravel near the water had been churned recently. He dismounted, crouching to study the ground. The tracks were deep and sharp-edged, not softened by weather, no more than a week old. He waited as the shadows lengthened, his instincts telling him to observe before acting. The hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the creek's sluggish gurgle and the occasional creak of old metal shifting in the wind. Just when he began to wonder if the site was truly abandoned, the low rumble of diesel engines reached his ears. Jonathan led his horse into the trees and crouched low, with Rocco pressed at his side, the dog's hackles bristling but silent. Through the tangled branches he watched as a convoy of trucks appeared from a dirt road to the east. They moved slowly, careful not to raise dust that might be seen from afar. The men who climbed down wore plain work clothes, no company logos, and their movements were practiced, efficient. They unrolled thick hoses from the trucks to the water's edge and began pumping a dark, viscous liquid directly into the creek. Jonathan felt a surge of anger so sharp it made his vision narrow. Here was the truth laid bare, an active, deliberate poisoning of the water that fed his farm and his neighbors' lands. The secrecy, the night operations, the lack of markings on the trucks. Everything spoke of a company that knew what it was doing was illegal and was counting on silence to keep it hidden. He pulled out his phone and began recording, hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He filmed the trucks, the men, the hoses snaking into the creek. He zoomed in on license plates when he could and took photos of the tire tracks for reference. Then he filled 2 glass jars from the edge of the polluted current, sealing them tight and stowing them in his saddlebag. The work went on into the evening, and Jonathan stayed hidden, memorizing the routine. When the trucks finally rumbled away under cover of dusk, he remained still, long after they had vanished, listening for any sign they might return. Only when the night deepened did he rise and lead his horse back downstream, Rocco keeping close. The soldier in him understood the risk of being seen and the power of solid evidence. He had what he needed. Now someone had to act. The following day, he drove his old pickup into town, Rocco curled quietly on the passenger seat. His first stop was the sheriff's office, a squat brick building that smelled of stale coffee and dust. Sheriff Earl Turner had known Jonathan since childhood, though not well. The man was weathered and shrewd, his badge polished bright against a faded uniform. When Jonathan laid out his story, showed the videos and the samples, Turner's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. He listened, brows drawn tight, but when he finally spoke, his voice was measured and cool. "This is big," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "Real big. You don't want to get mixed up in this, Reeves. That plant's been under some kind of corporate lease for years. Folks say it's tied to companies with deep pockets and deeper lawyers. Best leave this to the state inspectors." Jonathan pressed him quiet but relentless. The sheriff sighed and promised to make a call, but his eyes betrayed reluctance. As Jonathan left the office, he knew the man wouldn't move quickly, if at all. He had seen that look before in officers unwilling to engage when politics turned dangerous. Still, Jonathan tried to trust the system. He mailed 1 jar of water to the Regional Environmental Agency, filing a formal complaint. Weeks passed. When a white SUV with official markings finally arrived at the plant, he watched from a distance as 2 men in clean boots walked the perimeter, glanced briefly at the creek, then drove away after less than an hour. Days later, the local paper printed a brief notice. Recent testing of water sources upstream found no hazardous contamination. Residents may continue normal use. The hollow anger that filled Jonathan was worse than combat fear. In war, he had trusted his chain of command. Here, at home, there was no one to trust. The same week he read the article, a neighbor stopped by to ask if Jonathan's cattle had been sick lately. The man's own herd had lost 2 calves in unexplained seizures. Other farmers murmured similar worries at the feed store, though few were ready to blame the water. It was easier to believe in bad luck or some unnamed virus than to accuse a powerful company of poisoning their livelihoods. Jonathan's attempts to alert the local paper went nowhere. A young reporter listened, took notes, and then stopped returning calls. Another hinted off the record that their editor had warned them away from environmental alarmism tied to pending legal issues. At night, strange trucks idled at the edge of his property, headlights cutting across the fields before vanishing into the dark. The sense of being watched settled over him like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. Rocco's health worsened. The dog still followed Jonathan, but with less vigor, his gait uneven, his appetite unreliable. Jonathan switched his water to bottled supplies, but the damage seemed done. Each night, as the dog curled at the foot of the bed, Jonathan felt a cold fury grow where hope had been. He had fought for his country and returned to farm in peace, but the peace was proving false. A poison ran through this land, and not just in the water. The final straw came when Jonathan attended a meeting at the co-op, where local farmers gathered to discuss feed prices and weather patterns. He tried again to warn them, describing what he had seen. Some shifted uneasily, but others laughed it off, accusing him of paranoia born from war trauma. One man muttered that Jonathan had been out there too long and sees enemies in everything. No one wanted trouble with corporations or the county board. Silence was safer. Jonathan drove home from that meeting in the dark, headlights carving long beams through the mist. He felt more alone than he had since the night he'd first stepped off a transport plane into a combat zone. But unlike then, there was no chain of command, no clear allies. Only himself, an aging war dog, and a farm already suffering. Yet as he pulled into his driveway and saw Rocco lift his head from the porch with quiet loyalty, a decision hardened inside him. He had spent a lifetime following orders. Now he would give his own. If no one else would fight for this land, he would. The next morning, he dug out an old, battered field notebook from his service days. Inside, phone numbers and names from another life stared back at him. Fellow Marines, medics, engineers, men and women scattered across the country. People he trusted when everything was chaos. He ran his finger down the list, remembering faces, debts owed, lives saved together. For the first time in years, he reached for the phone with purpose. The war he thought he'd left behind was calling him back, not with bullets and sand, but with poisoned water and bought-off lawmen. He was done waiting. Night settled over the farm like a heavy cloak, but Jonathan Reeves did not sleep. The old field notebook lay open on the kitchen table, its pages illuminated by the pale glow of a single lamp. Coffee had long gone cold in his cup, forgotten beside a scatter of pens and scraps of paper covered with numbers. On one page, he had drawn a rough map of the creek, the abandoned plant, and the tire tracks that led to its hidden gates. On another, he had written names, men and women he had once trusted with his life, people who had walked through fire beside him in deserts half a world away. His fingers lingered on the first name before he picked up the phone. By dawn, the calls were done. Some numbers had changed, and a few voices he expected to hear never answered. But enough did. Old bonds forged in battle proved stronger than time and distance. There was Ethan, a former combat engineer now working as an environmental consultant. There was Carla, once a drone operator, now running a small aerial imaging business out west. Marcus, who had left the Marines to join a private security firm, and Devon, who had quietly built a reputation as an investigator willing to take on difficult, politically dangerous cases. Each of them had asked few questions. Jonathan's quiet, measured voice, the weight behind it, was enough to bring them. Within days, the first to arrive was Ethan. He rolled into the yard in a battered truck piled with equipment testing kits, portable sensors, and a laptop held together by tape and stubbornness. He greeted Jonathan with the easy familiarity of someone who had once shared a foxhole and then got straight to work. Together they tested water samples from the creek, the irrigation ditch, and even the rain barrel. The results were sobering: high levels of industrial solvents, heavy metals, and carcinogenic compounds. Ethan's face hardened as he read the data scrolling across the screen. This was no accidental runoff. Someone upstream was deliberately dumping waste far beyond legal limits, and the contamination was severe enough to poison not just fields, but people. Carla arrived 2 days later, her van fitted with cameras, drones, and mapping software. She had an edge of dry humor, but eyes that missed nothing. As she unloaded her gear, Rocco trotted over to sniff at the cases, tail wagging weakly. Carla knelt to stroke the aging dog, then looked up at Jonathan with a quiet nod of respect. That night, under cover of darkness, she launched her drones to scout the plant. Through the small screens, they watched in silence as the unmanned machines traced the perimeter, capturing images of hidden access roads, new tanks installed behind sagging fences, and fresh shipments of barrels arriving under floodlights. The site was anything but abandoned, It was operating like a secret refinery, invisible to regulators, but fully alive. Marcus and Devon came next. Marcus brought security expertise and a keen tactical mind. Devon brought contacts in investigative journalism and an instinct for where corporations hid their dirtiest secrets. Around Jonathan's kitchen table, the small team formed a plan. They would gather irrefutable evidence video, lab results, shipping logs, license plates, proof of corruption. Then they would bypass the local power structure entirely, sending the case directly to national outlets and federal agencies that could not be so easily bought. The work was methodical and dangerous. Each night they surveilled the plant from a safe distance, guided by Carla's drones and Marcus's careful scouting. They documented convoys of trucks arriving after dark, their plates traced through databases Devon had access to. Ethan took more water samples from different points, upstream and downstream, creating a map of contamination levels to prove how far the pollution spread. Jonathan, used to patience from his days on patrol, spent long hours hidden in the brush with binoculars. Rocco curled beside him, ears alert despite his fading strength. It didn't take long for the company to notice. The first warning came as a black SUV parked for an hour on the road opposite Jonathan's driveway, engine idling, windows dark. No one stepped out, but the message was clear. Another night, the motion lights near the barn snapped on, and Jonathan found fresh boot prints in the mud by the back door. Marcus, trained to read threats, quietly began carrying his sidearm more openly. Carla moved her van closer to the house at night, its roof cameras scanning the dark for movement. Then the attacks grew bolder. One morning, Jonathan woke to find his main storage shed in flames, the old boards collapsing into a heap of glowing ash. The volunteer fire department saved the house, but most of his tools and a year's worth of feed burned. No one came to ask questions. When he tried to file a report, the sheriff's deputy shrugged and suggested faulty wiring. Jonathan knew better. Rocco, restless and anxious, patrolled the yard each night now, barking hoarsely at shadows. The stress deepened his illness, but the dog refused to retreat indoors. Bank trouble followed. Jonathan received notice that his farm account had been frozen due to an investigation of unusual activity. He suspected this was no coincidence. Every move they made seemed to be met with counter-pressure. Someone powerful wanted them quiet, yet the team refused to stop. If anything, the intimidation hardened their resolve. These were people who had survived ambushes and bombardments. They would not back down over burning sheds and veiled threats. Their evidence pile grew formidable. Carla's drones captured high-resolution footage of waste tanks being offloaded and hoses running straight into the creek. Ethan's tests showed contamination levels that exceeded federal safety thresholds dozens of times over. Marcus traced security personnel at the plant to a private firm linked to the same corporate conglomerate that had leased the site. Devon uncovered political donations and backroom deals tying local officials to that conglomerate. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed an ugly picture. A company dumping hazardous chemicals to cut costs, protected by bribes and intimidation, while entire farming communities drank and irrigated with poisoned water. Jonathan sent the growing dossier to state environmental authorities again, hoping the weight of new data would force action. Weeks passed with no response. Instead, 2 unmarked pickups began parking on the ridge, overlooking his land each night, their headlights flickering like watchful eyes. Once, returning from a surveillance run, Marcus found tire spikes scattered along the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. They removed them silently, said nothing, but the message was clear. Stop. For Jonathan, the isolation cut deepest. Neighbors who once waved now avoided his gaze. Word had spread that he was stirring trouble, attracting city lawyers and regulators who might make life harder for everyone. At the feed store, conversations fell silent when he entered. Some whispered that war had broken him, that he was paranoid and looking for enemies because he couldn't adjust to peace. He said nothing. His focus remained fixed on the mission, though at night, sitting beside the weakening Rocco, he felt the ache of betrayal heavier than any wound from combat. One evening, after another day of fruitless phone calls and new reports of sick cattle, the team gathered around Jonathan's table in silence. The air was thick with frustration and fatigue. They had evidence enough to shake the county, but every official channel was blocked or corrupted. Devin finally broke the silence. They had one option left: take it national. He had contacts and investigative journalism people with the reach and courage to take on corporations, even when lawsuits and political pressure followed. But they needed one more decisive piece: undeniable proof of illegal dumping happening in real time, with identifiable operators and equipment. Jonathan looked out the window, where the creek glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The decision came easily, born of the same quiet grit that had carried him through patrols and ambushes overseas. They would catch the company in the act, with enough cameras and sensors to make denial impossible. They would risk exposure, risk retaliation, but they would end the silence. Plans formed quickly. Carla calibrated her drones for night vision and long-range tracking. Marcus scouted high ground and safe retreats. Ethan prepared specialized sensors to measure toxins as they were discharged. Devin coordinated with journalists willing to publish once the evidence arrived. Jonathan readied himself for the kind of operation he hadn't run since leaving the Marines a stakeout, a strike of information instead of bullets. That night, after the others went to rest, Jonathan sat on the porch with Rocco's head resting against his boot. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes still bright with that familiar, unwavering loyalty. Jonathan stroked the coarse fur, feeling the quiet heartbeat beneath. So much had changed since he came home. He had wanted nothing more than a quiet life of soil and seasons, but war had taught him one unshakable truth: when no one else will stand between danger and the innocent, someone must. Out here, that someone was him. He whispered a promise to the dog and to the dark fields, stretching beyond the porch. They would not stop now. Too many families depended on this water. Too many children drank from poisoned taps, while officials looked away. The next move would be dangerous, but it would end the company's secrecy once and for all. And when the truth finally reached the light, it would not be silenced again. The night chosen for the final operation came cold and windless, a brittle hush lying over the farmland, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Jonathan Reeves stood in the darkened yard, a heavy jacket thrown over his shoulders, the faint smell of charred wood still lingering where the shed had once stood before the fire. His team moved around him with quiet efficiency. Ethan checked the portable sensors one last time, ensuring each unit would capture the exact composition of whatever spilled into the creek. Carla crouched over her drones, their rotors whispering in readiness, while laptop screens glowed like dim campfires. Marcus walked the perimeter with the silent confidence of a man who had spent years moving unseen in dangerous places. Devin was on the phone, murmuring to a contact in New York who had promised that if they got what they needed tonight, the story would run no matter who tried to stop it. Rocco sat near Jonathan's boots, ears pricked despite the slow weariness that sickness had laid upon him, eyes shining like coals in the low light. Jonathan felt the familiar tension of a mission coil inside him, calm, precise, but edged with the knowledge of risk. There would be no backup if things went wrong. The local sheriff had chosen his side long ago, and the company had shown it would strike back when threatened. But this was the path they had chosen, and he knew from his soldiers' bones that some fights must be met head-on. They moved out before midnight, leaving the safety of the farmhouse, and following a rough trail that Marcus had scouted earlier. The moon was thin and veiled, perfect for concealment. Carla launched the first drone once they were a mile from the site, its silent eyes climbing into the sky to scout ahead. On her screen, the abandoned plant came into view, skeletal in the darkness, but alive with quiet movement. Security lights glowing near the main gate, a pair of trucks idling with no headlights. More vehicles were expected. This was the company's chosen hour for its dirtiest work, when rural roads lay empty and no one was supposed to be watching. They settled into positions that would keep them hidden, yet close enough to record everything. Jonathan lay prone behind a low ridge of gravel, binoculars raised, while Rocco pressed against his side, warm and steady despite his labored breath. Ethan and Marcus placed the chemical sensors along the bank, securing them in mud and weeds. Carla's drones drifted higher, circling like silent hawks, their cameras capturing wide sweeps of the site, while another focused close on the pipes that jutted toward the water. An hour passed before the first convoy arrived. 3 trucks with their headlights dimmed rolled slowly along the access road, engines low and careful. Men jumped down, moving with the practiced rhythm Jonathan had seen in covert operations overseas. They unspooled thick black hoses and ran them straight to the water's edge. Someone activated a pump, and a dark, sluggish torrent began to snake into the creek, spreading in slow, oily tendrils across the current. The smell hit even from their distance, a metallic tang mixed with chemical rot that made Jonathan's stomach clench. Carla whispered an update, voice tight with awe and disgust as her screens filled with clear, night vision footage. Trucks, hoses, the shimmer of toxic liquid spilling unchecked into public waters. Ethan's instruments chirped faintly as they logged toxin levels spiking to catastrophic heights. Devin murmured updates to the journalist on the other end of his secure line, his face lit by the glow of a laptop, transmitting the footage in real time to multiple off-site backups. Marcus watched through the scope of a long-lens camera, methodically capturing license plates and faces in case someone later claimed the evidence was fabricated. For Jonathan, it was both vindication and fury. Every dead fish, every sick animal, every field poisoned back home was flowing from this single act, repeated, night after night. These men worked casually, laughing sometimes, confident in the silence their employers had purchased. He tightened his grip on the binoculars and forced himself to stay still. The mission was to expose, not confront. Tonight was about truth too clear to bury. Halfway through the dumping, headlights swept across the ridge where they hid. A smaller security truck patrolled the perimeter, its driver scanning the dark with a spotlight. Jonathan's heart thudded as the beam grazed the brush where they lay. Rocco let out a low growl, but quieted instantly when Jonathan's hand pressed against his neck. Marcus gestured for everyone to stay down. The light lingered, wavered, then moved on. The truck circled once and disappeared back toward the gate, apparently satisfied. They exhaled as one, silent but more determined than ever. By the time the convoy finished and rolled away, they had hours of footage, samples, and data impossible to deny. Still, Carla sent one drone to follow the trucks discreetly, capturing where they left the main road, and which depot swallowed them into darkness. Devin confirmed that the files were uploaded to multiple secure servers and in the hands of journalists who had been waiting to strike. For the first time in weeks, Jonathan felt a flicker of something like hope. They had done it. No amount of bribed inspectors or burned sheds could erase what had been captured tonight. Dawn was breaking when they rode back to the farm, exhausted but wired with adrenaline. Jonathan walked beside Rocco, who limped more noticeably now, but held his head high. When they reached the porch, the team gathered silently, watching the first light touch the fields they had sworn to defend. No speeches were made. They were soldiers again in a way, bound by action rather than words. The impact came fast. Within days, major news outlets ran explosive headlines about illegal toxic dumping in rural America. Video from Carla's drones opened every broadcast. Trucks caught red-handed, poison spilling into waterways that served entire communities. Ethan's test results were cited in reports, warning of cancer-causing agents and neurological damage. Devon's investigations linked the plant to a vast corporate network and laid bare the political payoffs that had kept it operating in secret. The story spread nationally, then internationally, as outrage grew. Federal agencies that had ignored Jonathan's earlier pleas now had no choice. Inspectors arrived in convoys of white SUVs, escorted by marshals rather than local deputies. They seized records, sealed the site, and announced criminal investigations. The company tried to deny, then to threaten lawsuits, but the evidence was overwhelming and public. Executives were subpoenaed. The plant shut down within a week. Several local officials, including the county water board and the sheriff himself, faced inquiries for accepting bribes and falsifying reports. For a region long forgotten by oversight, it was a reckoning. The reprisals against Jonathan and his friends did not stop overnight. Anonymous threats arrived in the mail. A shadowy pickup truck lingered on distant roads for weeks. But the tide had turned. Federal protection extended quietly to those who had exposed the crime, and journalists hungry for follow-up stories made it dangerous for the company to strike back openly. Marcus remained a quiet sentinel, ensuring no one came too close. Carla stayed long enough to see her footage spark national reform talk. Ethan testified before regulators, his data forcing new safety mandates. Devon's reporting career soared, but he remained in touch, promising the story would never be buried. For the farming community, the reckoning was bittersweet. Government cleanup crews worked to flush the creek and restore the soil, but damage lingered. Many farmers, Jonathan included, lost livestock and crops. A federal compensation fund was created, but money could not replace years of trust, broken or land scarred by poisons. Some neighbors who had once mocked Jonathan avoided him now out of shame. Others came quietly to thank him, voices rough with regret. He accepted both reactions with the same quiet stoicism. He had not fought for gratitude. He had fought because someone had to. His own farm bore scars beyond the burned shed. Several pastures were unusable for the season, and income was uncertain. Yet Jonathan worked on, repairing fences, sowing what he could, replanting where the soil showed signs of healing. Each day was hard, but purposeful. Rocco remained at his side, though the sickness had left him weaker. His once tireless body slowed by the toxins he had likely ingested before Jonathan understood the danger. Jonathan built the dog a shaded rest area near the porch and carried him up the steps when his legs failed. They had survived war together. They would survive this too. One evening, months after the story broke, Jonathan sat on that same porch with the summer fields stretching green and new beyond the fence lines. Rocco lay with his head in Jonathan's lap, eyes half closed, but content. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of government cleanup crews and the softer sounds of neighbors tending repaired farms. Life was returning, uneven but determined. He thought about the long road from the day he'd found the dead heifer to this moment. He had wanted peace so desperately when he came home. But peace built on silence was no peace at all. He had once believed his duty ended when he left the Marines, yet the land had asked something more of him. He had answered, not with a rifle this time, but with truth and persistence. He had stood between danger and those who could not or would not see it, and though the fight had cost him dearly, it felt right. As twilight fell and fireflies rose from the grass, Jonathan ran his hand over Rocco's fur, whispering gratitude to the dog who had once saved him and had guided him again in a quieter war. Together they looked out over the land they had fought to protect, knowing the battle had changed them, but had also restored something deep and essential. The farm was scarred, but alive, and so was he. In the soft dark, with the creek at last running clean, Jonathan Reeves felt the hard-won truth settle in his chest. Even a man who only wanted to plant and heal could be called again to stand guard. And answering that call was not a curse, but an honor. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more unforgettable stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.